a reasonable person might not know a whole lot about it. And it's really easy to make the claim that nuclear waste is this big, bad, awful thing. I do believe it's overblown. Nuclear waste, especially in Canada, has been stored safely and successfully for decades. We've never had an issue.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues. Hello and welcome to The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. This episode is another in my series leading up to the Stand Up for Nuclear events coming up in September 2021, and hopefully every year thereafter. In this episode, I'll be interviewing another Canadian organizer and a nuclear industry professional. We'll discuss the controversy over Canada's deep geological repository, one of the leading options for long-term mitigation of nuclear waste hazards. If you enjoy what you're hearing on this podcast and you like my show, be sure to hit like on your podcast app. I'd love to have you leave a review or share it with your friends. And I'd love to hear from you on my Facebook group, The Rational View. I've got some big news for you. If you're a follower of this podcast, I've got an interview coming up in the fall of 2021 with Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson. So that's big news. I'm really excited. We'll talk about science and cool stuff, probably touch on astronomy, maybe even touch on nuclear power and climate crisis. Really looking forward to it, so stay tuned. Sheila Whytock is a nuclear operator at Bruce Power in Ontario, Canada. Sheila got her BA at Laurentian University, her Bachelor of Education at Wilfrid Laurier University, and completed a power operator apprenticeship while working for Bruce Power. She was raised on a beef farm in Orillia and now resides in Teeswater, one of the potential host sites for Canada's deep geological repository. Sheila is co-founder of Willing to Listen, a grassroots group interested in pursuing the facts and benefits associated with potentially hosting a deep geological repository in their community. Along with this, she is also host of the podcast Willing to Listen, board member of Canadians for Nuclear Energy, local contact for Mothers for Nuclear Canada, and local organizer of Stand Up for Nuclear events within Ontario. Sheila, welcome to The Rational View.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. You are very active in the pro-nuclear field. How did you get interested in nuclear energy growing up on a beef farm in Aurelia?
Yeah, it's quite the story, but my husband actually is an operator here as well. And it kind of started when I got my Bachelor of Education, and jobs were hard to come by, permanent, reliable jobs at the time. You had to volunteer and supply for quite a while before you could get a full-time job. And he suggested that he thought I'd be a good fit for the operator job. So I started pursuing that, and I got hired here myself. And then through my own time here, got to learn that a lot of public perceptions of nuclear and nuclear energy are not true. And that kind of got me involved in the advocacy side.
So how long have you been an operator at Bruce?
It was 8 years in May.
Wow. So what exactly is a nuclear operator? Is that like what Homer Simpson does?
Well, sort of. Homer Simpson is quite the horrible example, actually, of operator. But a control room operator would do a similar job to Homer, only it would be much more serious. They sit in front of our panels upstairs and control the reactors or our common services. I am a field operator.
Okay.
So I am going around. It's always tough to explain this, but we go around and do our rounds and routines. We check our equipment, make sure that everything is operating as expected. We do any safety system testing. We call them SSTs, to make sure that our safety systems like the vacuum building and emergency coolant injection and standby generators and all those things work as expected. And then we also do work permits. So if something needs to be taken out of service for maintenance or repairs, we make sure that it's safe for people to work on it.
Wow, that's cool.
And probably 100 other things that I've forgotten. But
Yeah. No, that's great. So Bruce is like the workhorse of Canada's nuclear industry. Like that's producing a good chunk of Ontario's power. How much of Ontario's power does Bruce produce?
Bruce Power currently produces around 30% of Ontario's power.
30% of Ontario's electrical power.
Yeah.
That's a third. That's huge.
Yeah.
And it's clean, no carbon dioxide nuclear power. What's the morale like inside the nuclear facility? It seems like nuclear power has been kind of a taboo subject in the media, and especially in progressive environmental circles. Is there a feeling that society is against you? Or is it?
I don't think so around here, especially in Bruce County. Bruce Power is the single largest employer in our county. It has changed our county for the better. I don't think that, let me take a step back. So the last few years are a little different, but before that, nuclear workers didn't really have a taboo on them other than, the odd time you go, they're a point worker. People sometimes look down on good paying union jobs, which is a different thing, but never really related to what we do specifically.
Okay. But you said more recently things have changed?
Yeah, a little bit. With the potential of this deep geological repository, we've seen a lot of, I call them anti-nuclear activists kind of coming out of the woodwork. And, I hear it more because I'm in the town that's potentially a host community, but comments about nuclear workers don't care about our safety. They're just doing what's best for the industry. Little snide remarks about things like that. And the general anti-nuclear sentiment seems to be growing among opponents of the DGR. We hear all the time now that nuclear power should be shut down and all of that great stuff. That's great to hear when you're employed there.
You hear that a lot. In general, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there that has to be cut through. So I applaud your efforts to be
it's not easy, that's for sure.
to be pro nuclear. So you're hosting the Stand Up for Nuclear event, as am I. I'm doing one in Ottawa. You're doing one where? Kincardine. This is a long overdue celebration of our climate heroes in the clean nuclear industry. Tell me a bit about the event you're hosting.
So right now I've got a lot going on. So unfortunately my stand-up event isn't the top of my priority list. It should be. But right now we're just kind of hosting it as an open house to stop by Victoria Park in Kincardine, say hi. We're going to put together a little scavenger hunt for kids, have some gummy bears for people to take home.
Nice.
Hopefully a couple of information pamphlets, and we're hoping to do a draw. And we don't know yet how we're going to do that, but it's something we are planning. Yeah,
the gummy bear has become the kind of the representative of the uranium pellet, and it's a great way to reach out to kids and get them familiar with nuclear as well.
Yeah.
One thing you hear a lot about in the public is as a nuclear professional, you probably hear it a lot as well. How do you feel as a nuclear professional about what about the waste argument? Is that an overblown fear? Like, why is this top billing? No, nuclear waste hasn't ever hurt anyone, has it?
No. It's never hurt. Civilian nuclear waste has never hurt anyone. The what about the waste? I feel like it's very much the anti-nuclear activists clinging to something that is difficult to understand. It's a very technical concept. And a reasonable person might not know a whole lot about it. And it's really easy to make the claim that nuclear waste is this big, bad, awful thing. I do believe it's overblown. Nuclear waste, especially in Canada, has been stored safely and successfully for decades. We've never had an issue. Like I said, it's definitely anti-nuclear activists just trying to have something to argue against.
So when I first chatted with you, I was saying that I was opposed to a deep geological repository because I'd rather recycle the partially used fuel in power society for thousands of years. But you disagreed. Why do you support the DGR as a nuclear professional?
I wouldn't say that I disagree with the recycling aspect, but I do disagree with the notion that we don't need a DGR.
Okay.
And for two reasons, because right now the waste is safe where it is, but it's very heavily reliant on oversight and human intervention to keep it that way. I was speaking to someone and they had said it takes about 100 people employed to keep the fuel safe where it is by monitoring, and eventually there'll be upgrades to casks and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel very strongly that we need to come up with a solution that does not require human intervention before we actually need it. If we're ever in a situation where, the government or the employees can't look after the fuel, we're not going to be able to implement anything. It's probably going to be a situation like another world war where we won't have time because, a DGR takes time.
I see.
And the fuel is retrievable up until the point when they seal the DGR. They can get it back out, which is at the discretion of the community and the regulator. So as long as the community feels there's a benefit to keeping it open or feels there's the potential to reprocess the fuel, we can bring it back up and do so.
Okay, so if you do eventually get a breeder reactor facility going where you could reuse the 95% of the fuel that wasn't burnt the first time through, then you can go back and get it as long as it hasn't been sealed off due to some other problem. Yeah,
and my understanding is the placement rooms get sealed off first, but all of the access tunnels are still there until they actually seal the whole facility. So we're looking at least 100, 150 years before they look at doing that.
Okay, well, that's significant.
So there's a long time frame there, and if we always make it a point to pass on to the next generation that we don't want to seal it, then it won't be sealed.
Interesting. So maybe for the listeners, can you outline what the situation is in Canada with the deep geological repositories and what the pathway is to get to having a deep geological repository?
Sure, yeah. The Nuclear Waste Management Organization was given the mandate to, permanently store our fuel, our spent fuel, or to make a plan to store the spent fuel. And they did consultation with Canadians, and a deep geological repository was overwhelmingly what people seem to have wanted. So the NWMO started a process to look for a willing host community. It's always been their mandate that they will not force a DGR on a community that does not want it, which I think is a good starting point.
Mm-hmm.
They started with 22, I think, communities that had stepped up and said we'd be willing to look into this, and it has slowly dwindled down to 2. So South Bruce here in Bruce County, and then Ignace up in Northern Ontario are the last 2 remaining in the process. So where both sites are undergoing borehole drilling to see what the rock looks like, which is a huge deal for the DGR, the kind of rock that it goes into. It's one of the safety barriers. And we're also waiting to determine if the communities are willing or not to host it, which is another big question. Okay, so at this point, we don't know whether the science or the geology of these sites will support a DGR. Right. We're just in the very early stages of this. What's the timeline for this to go ahead if we find a community is interested? So they are wanting to determine a willing community or pick a host community by 2023 is kind of the timeline that we've been seeing a lot. And it looks like about 10 years after that for licensing and construction. Mm-hmm. And it looks, I can't remember if operations would start in 2033 or if operations would start in 2030 or 2043. I can't remember the exact timeline. I've got a lot of numbers in my head. Okay. But it's a long ways out anyway. It's definitely, if they decide that a community is willing in 2023, nothing will be built for a while. I see. And what's the discussion like around the pros and cons of hosting a DGR? Are people worried about nuclear accidents, or I assume that the fear that's out there surrounding nuclear power is on everybody's mind. What are the real issues surrounding a DGR, if any? I think some of the real issues definitely are safety. This is the thing when I try to explain a DGR to people. A lot of people think about Chernobyl and Fukushima Daiichi and 3 Mile Island and the major reactor meltdowns, and they equate that with waste storage. I see it all the time that we'll be the next Chernobyl if we have a DGR here. And I think what people don't really understand is that a DGR and waste storage is exponentially safer than a reactor, and the reactors are crazy safe. And I think it's trying to explain the difference, that the waste is sitting there, it's not fissioning, there's no reaction happening, it's just kind of hanging out, doing its thing, getting less radioactive every day that it sits there.
Losing its activity.
Yes, and I think it's just really hard to explain to people that, you can't really equate the two. And it's trying to separate those feelings, because I think those are really real fears. People who experience Chernobyl and experience Fukushima, it's a real event that happened to them. And I'm sure it was terrifying at the time when we didn't know as much about nuclear as we do now. And yeah, I'm not trying to downplay those feelings, but I feel like it's just that separation needs to happen, and it's really hard to do.
Yeah. So what are the rational fears surrounding a DGR? You say there are safety issues.
Yeah, I think, people are worried about the water being contaminated, which by my calculations would take millions of years to ever happen, if it happened. And that's like worst case scenario failure of a DGR.
And that's because of the design of these DGRs to put them in a place where the water just moves over geological timescales, right? Yeah.
So the way it looks right now, what I know based on what they did for the low and intermediate DGR, the potential one in Bruce Power's site, was the rock hydraulic conductivity was something like 3 million years for radionuclides to travel 1 meter in the rock. So it's astronomical timescales we're looking at, longer than humans have existed, but multiples.
And at that point, the waste is no longer dangerous.
Yeah, and it's I don't know. I guess it could be a concern, if they picked a spot that they didn't analyze the rock, or if they really misstepped in container planning or container engineering. But I do believe that the NWMO has a really good plan. I do think that it was safe. I don't really have a whole lot of issues with safety. I can see why some people would. I have a lot more concerns, like socioeconomic concerns about, growth of our town. We live in a really small town. Do we want to become a really big town? How do we stop that from happening with a huge employer coming in? I have concerns more like that.
I see.
More not so much safety. If the rock is good, when the boreholes come back, I'll know for sure how I feel about safety. But there's other low level concerns, I would say. But on the whole, if the rock is good, I think it's a pretty safe plan.
Yeah, the containers that the dry casks are very difficult to damage, very unlikely to be, punctured in any sort of accident. Those things are tested to withstand, huge impacts and explosions, and it's not like this is liquid waste from the fuel either. These are metal rods, right?
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too. I said to somebody once, transportation is probably my biggest concern. And even then I'm not that concerned. I know how they test the containers. People do say, well, accidents happen. You can't control that, which is true. Accidents happen. But the point of the cask testing is to ensure that when accidents happen, the container remains whole and nothing escapes from the container. So it's not so much preventing accidents as it is preventing the effects of an accident.
Yeah, I think the bigger risk would be the increased traffic resulting in traffic accidents, just normal run-of-the-mill traffic accidents that you would have to experience, as you said, with a larger city with more economic activity going on. Yeah.
Well, and interesting when we talk about accidents, there was comments about an accident in Northern Ontario that was hauling some sort of nuclear waste, or some sort of medical nuclear something. And anyway, in this truck accident, people died. The vehicles lit on fire and people died. They were unrecognizable. And they were identified, I think, by dental records or something. But, people say that, nuclear waste, it did that. But those deaths had nothing to do with the nuclear waste on the truck. They are unfortunate and awful and traumatic. And I am not implying that they're not. But to say that that's because it was nuclear stuff on the truck is ridiculous,
You really have to go that extra mile as a nuclear industry employee, because anything you do is going to be held against the nuclear industry as a whole, it seems.
Yeah.
No, talking about the science about water moving slowly over millions of years, I think not a lot of people are aware, but there's actually been natural uranium reactors that operated in 500 million years ago in Aurelia, where they actually, over millions of years, water ran through uranium-rich rock and created nuclear waste, effectively exposed in the rock and exposed in the surface. And over the intervening 500,000 billion years, whatever it's been, this stuff is moved less than 10 meters.
Yeah. That analogy really blows my mind. And it's funny here in Canada because our reactors run on, they're CANDU reactors. They use natural uranium. And I've had people tell me that you can't compare that to nuclear fuel because it's not the same. I'm like, no, actually, that is exactly the same because that's exactly what we would put in our reactor. So it's literally the same.
Yeah. People are used to the U.S. version where they enrich the fuel. So you've, as a very active proponent of nuclear energy, you've started a group called Willing to Listen. Tell me about why you started this group and what the group represents.
Yeah, so Willing to Listen is kind of it's my baby right now. It started out of, I will just say, sheer anger, really. There's no other way to say it. We have a very loud anti-nuclear group in the South Bruce that has come about with this DGR stuff, and they were sharing and continue to share things that are just blatantly not true or inaccurate or misrepresented. And as a nuclear worker, it was really frustrating to me. I still see things every day that if I responded to everything, I would literally have to quit my job because I would take all my time to respond to it. But I don't, there was nobody else standing up and saying, this stuff's not true. Like, this isn't accurate. And I really felt that presence needed to be there, which has proven true. We have a lot of people involved with Willing to Listen, paying attention. We've had people who've told us they've changed their mind on how they feel about the DGR based on what we tell them and what we share, which I think is good. But we're not really out to change minds. We just want to make sure that the people who haven't decided yet are getting information from multiple sources and trying to make sure that the information out there is being corrected if it's not true. So
you're like a fact-checking organization for the DGR?
Well, kind of. I wouldn't go quite that far because I don't necessarily guarantee that what I say is accurate either, but I'm pretty quick to step up and admit when I've got it wrong. So
no, that's good. I think it's necessary. And I think you're right that a lot of I think there's a lot of people that are afraid to speak up because of the sort of rabid anti-nuclear loud voices at the far extreme of the political spectrum. People are afraid to get involved. And I think there is a quiet majority out there that is willing to listen. And I hope that you can find them with your work. I think that's great that you've done that. So how's the podcast going?
It's funny, actually, though, when you mention the quiet majority and, being scared to speak up, because we do have a very large group of people in South Bruce who don't want to speak up for whatever reason. We've had people that have had their jobs threatened. People have gone and tried to get people fired from their jobs. We've had people threaten business owners that they won't do business with them anymore if they support the DGR. So we just have a lot of people who don't want to say how they feel, don't want to be involved, out of fear of judgment and persecution, basically, wow. Which I think is really sad. It's a really sad state of affairs when you go that route. And all that blame is being put on our council and the NWMO, saying that it's their fault. Nobody's really wanting to take responsibility for their actions. And it's kind of disheartening when you come from a small town to see that happening.
Mm-hmm. That really isn't good. You don't want to see that sort of thing. And that's when the debates become polarized and people aren't willing to talk and people start using ad hominems and they start threatening rather than putting up an argument. That's not good. So I'm glad you're calling them out. That takes some bravery. So you started a podcast. How's it going?
It's going. It's a little more than I thought I was getting into. It's a little more than I bargained for, but, what started as kind of a Facebook group for advocacy, it's really hard to keep people's attention on Facebook. They like short, snappy, quick things they can share. They don't want to read a lot of stuff. So it's difficult.
Home of the meme.
Yeah, it's really difficult to explain nuclear power and nuclear waste issues in a meme, or in a pic. Like, it's so hard because it's so complicated. So yeah, I find the podcast a little bit better of an avenue for that.
I agree.
So yeah, I really think like the sky's the limit there. I'm just getting started, but I've got tons of ideas for people to come on and things to talk about. So I'm really hoping that it picks up in its audience and that, the word gets around.
That's great. I'm super stoked to see you doing that. And it's the same reason that I started this podcast. It's like, it's just so tiring arguing on social media. It seems like social media has become, basically just weaponized meme posting to ridicule a straw man on both sides. And everyone's sitting happily in their echo chamber, ridiculing straw men, and nobody's talking. And you really need to have kind of the time scale of a podcast to get an issue across and to really dig into things. And that's I really like that part about the medium, the fact that you can talk to people, talk to experts. And I use this to learn. I mean, this is great. I talk to you and I've learned stuff, and I just talk to all the people that are involved and find out where they sit on the issues and what they know, and so I get to learn with my listeners.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny when you talk about the echo chamber, because that's very much what's happening in South Bruce with our opposition group. Is, any of the very vocal people who are not opposed to the project, who would speak up and correct misinformation, have all been banned from their Facebook page. It's quite hilarious, actually, the number of us who've been banned. I think it's funny, Yeah,
you find that everywhere. It's crazy. It's tiring thinking about arguments that don't jive with your preconceived notions. It's difficult to think about outside the box, and it's very difficult to change your opinion especially if you've gone and posted memes on Facebook. That takes, oh, I'm wrong.
Yeah.
That's very difficult.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and that's what I've said to people too. I get asked all the time, like, what's going to change your mind? Or, when will you decide if you're actually for or against this DGR? And my answer always is, when the boreholes come up, I think will be my big deciding factor. They reach 715 meters. They're going to 900 in the boreholes. So borehole number 1 will be done soon.
Cool.
And yeah, I've said too, if the rock sucks, I'll put a yellow no DGR sign on my lawn, because if it's crap, I don't want it here. If the rock sucks,
sure, I
don't want to hear any more from the next guy. I've got kids here. My nieces and nephews are here. My friends' kids are here. I don't want to see anybody get hurt. If it's not going to be safe, I don't want it here as much as the next guy.
Well, that's something that I learned in an interview with James Conca, actually. Dr. Conca has been involved with the U.S. Deep Geological Repositories, Yucca Mountain, and the WIP facility, which is the actual operating one for the waste from weapons. And basically, they've spent a lot of money on Yucca Mountain, but it's not a good scientific solution because the rock is fractured.
Yep.
Whereas the WIP one is this ancient salt bed, basically, that it's self-sealing. Any sort of heat seals it better. Mm-hmm. It's just the ideal place to put it. It's a no-brainer.
Yep.
If you have something like that to put the nuclear waste. It's been there for billions of years, and it'll stay there for billions of years. So yeah, the science is what people should be listening to, and I'm sure that's going to come out, and hopefully it's a good solution, and maybe will help people to be more comfortable with nuclear power, because I think that's what we want to achieve by getting a DGR in Canada, is that people become more comfortable with the perceived risk of nuclear waste.
The perceived risk, yeah. It's always hard, though, to change people's emotional response. That's what I find most anti-nuclear sentiments, whether they're against nuclear power, nuclear waste, is, first of all, the acquaintance with nuclear weapons, which is irrelevant, but people do it. And, that emotional reaction, it's really hard to cut that emotional reaction.
Yeah, it's always made it hard as a proponent, because I remember back in the 70s and 80s when the anti-nuclear weapons testing, most right-thinking people are against open-air nuclear weapons testing. Let's stop this. We're spreading radiation. We don't need to do this. There's no good reason for it. But then the nuclear power kind of got caught up in that, and it was hard to stand up and make that differentiation argument. Yeah. And I see it as almost a swords to plowshares kind of thing. We're taking the nuclear fuel and we're using it for good rather than leaving it available for weapons.
I know those emotional things are definitely my thing, or trying to break that connection, I guess, not make the connection, it's break that connection. Because I'm all for stopping nuclear weapons. I think they're awful things, but that doesn't mean I'm against nuclear power. They don't all go hand in hand.
Yeah. It's and people make decisions based on emotions. I've learned that as well in this podcast. Rational decisions are very rare. Most of the time, we use our rational faculty to rationalize the emotional decision that we've made.
Yeah, and I do find that actually I've said before to people, speaking to them on the street in town. We have like rational opposition, and then we have our radical opposition. There's two different camps there. There are people who I think are legit just concerned about, socioeconomic status and like how that's going to affect the town and things like that. And then there's the people who just don't want a DGR in our town, hard stop for whatever reason. And, they're not willing to listen to any science or reasoning because they just don't want it.
There seems to be a groundswell of NIMBYism in just about every issue that you can think of that has a downside. Nobody wants to have it in their backyard. And that's going to lead us to back into the Stone Age.
Well, and that can be said about anything, really. We've been, in my work with Willing to Listen, I've done a lot of research on some of the big projects around Teeswater and South Bruce, specifically Teeswater. And years and years and years ago, they wanted to put in sewers. And there was a big group of people who did not want sewers put in, like just no sewers. But then by the time they got around to actually doing it, the cost had doubled, obviously, because it was however long later. Or even just opposition to Kinetrix has a laundry facility in town, and people are, what are they doing there? What's happening there? There was discussion about possibly them expanding. There was discussion of maybe doing medical isotopes there.
Cool.
Which, like, to me, I'm like, that would be fantastic. Like, let's do that. Let's save people's lives. That's a great idea. No, we don't want that. Opposition didn't want that happening. We have a marijuana farm outside of town. People wrote letters to council about, marijuana farms and how they're horrible. And we don't want one next door. And it's like, is there anything you don't oppose? Like, it does turn into that bananas argument, that build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone or whatever it is.
I've never heard of that one. That's good.
But I'm like, it's true. These same people oppose everything that comes to town that doesn't directly benefit them.
Yeah. And it's basically the slog that we have decided to take on to try to change minds one at a time if necessary.
Yeah. I feel very strongly that nuclear power is needed for climate change. I feel very strongly about that, regardless of what my job is. People always say that I say that just because I work at Bruce Power. But I don't. I definitely feel that it's important and it's required, and it's the best way to get energy to everyone. Instead of the billions of people who don't have electricity. And I think the best way to do that is to have a solution to the fuel so that people can stop using that as their talking point. And I do believe that's why anti-nuclear activists fight against DGRs and storage solutions, is because they don't want a solution. Like, it's in their best interest and their pocketbook's best interest to not have a solution to waste.
Right. Yeah. If you take away that one of the three stool legs of the anti-nuclear argument, then suddenly nuclear energy becomes viable.
Yeah, exactly. It's like,
all you got left is, what about Chernobyl?
Yeah, I do feel very strongly that is the motivation there with anti-nuclear activists, and they cling on to small community groups like we have in South Bruce, and feed them stuff that's not true to scare them because they maybe don't know any different. And, they tell them nuclear workers can't be trusted, because I get told that all the time, that I can't be trusted as a nuclear worker. And, it's just the perfect storm, really. They scare people out of their pants and it works.
Well, anyone who speaks up for the science is going to be labeled as a nuclear shill. I've been also labeled the same in any online argument when they run out of pamphlets to throw at you. And The ad hominems begin.
The thing that I read the other day, and I totally think it's true. If someone ends a conversation with "you're a nuclear shill," you've won the conversation, because they cannot argue your facts anymore. So once they start throwing out, "Oh, you're just a shill," you've won. Yeah,
then that's exactly it. And then you walk away. The reason we argue isn't to change the minds of the convinced. It's to basically show the facts and convince the people that are quietly listening. Yeah. About where, people that have honest questions. And I like your title, "Willing to Listen." That really does capture the essence of that stance, I think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I get questioned on that title a lot. Our opposition will say, "I'm not willing to listen to those opposed," which isn't true. If there's a rational, reasonable point of opposition, I will absolutely look into that for somebody. I will spend the time with the connections that I've made in the industry and outside the industry to find them an answer. But I won't entertain things that are ridiculous. Like, I won't entertain them because I don't have time for that. If it's something that's been proven over and over again, I don't have time to rehash that. Like, a specific example is the thickness of the copper coating on the canisters in Canada is proposed for 3 millimeters. And, people keep saying that's not safe because in Sweden, they've decided 5 centimeters isn't enough. But they don't talk about the flawed research, that came to that conclusion, or all the rebuttal research that's happened since that's proven that actually the copper is fine. They don't talk about any of that. They stick to the one talking point and bring it up repeatedly. So I've just stopped addressing that point because it's been dealt with in my mind, and, it's not a concern. But for anyone not following along, they don't know that. They don't know that that's been dealt with.
Well, there's such a mess of online videos out there that live forever, and every new person who's indoctrinated into the anti-nuclear talking points has to go through them. And every time I basically gather up a list of rebuttals for each discussion that you get into with a new person.
Yeah, it's really time consuming, but in the end, like I said, I think it's worth it. I think nuclear power is important, and I think the DGR is important. Whether it goes in South Bruce or not, I don't know. I want it to go wherever it's safe. But, I think these things are important, and we need to try to take emotion out of it and use our rational brain.
Well, that's a great ending point for the Rational View discussion. Thank you so much for joining me. Before I go, I have a question for you that I ask a lot of my guests.
Okay.
What kind of science fiction do you like?
I read a lot of books. Actually, I went through a phase where I read a lot of dystopian stuff, like post-apocalypse kind of things, which is, kind of weird. But I read a lot of that. But lately, it's all nuclear stuff. That's all I do now is nuclear power research, which is depressing. But I have to step off and do some recreational reading again.
Well, thank you so much, Sheila. I appreciate you coming on and talking to us, and good luck keeping the lights on in Ontario.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, and I will do my best.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/TheRationalView. Thanks for listening.